All right, so we are now approximately almost a week in to this Israeli offensive into the Gaza Strip in the aftermath of that Hamas attack into southern Israel. And so I got a couple different things that I wanted to touch on here for you guys, both in terms of the updated casualty numbers that we have gotten, and as well as some pretty serious allegations of brazen war crimes that have been committed by the Israeli military. So here to start us off with the AP, they say Gaza hospitals are overwhelmed with patients and desperately low on supplies as a ground invasion is currently looming. They say medics in Gaza warned on Sunday that thousands could die as hospitals packed with wounded people ran desperately low on fuel and basic supplies. And obviously this is directly a result and exacerbated by the fact that Israel has cut off everything from getting into the Gaza Strip. That includes emergency humanitarian aid that they have denied being allowed through the southern Rafah crossing with Egypt. It also is due to the fact that they have cut off their electricity and water, although I've heard some more recent reports that maybe they're allowing some water to get into the southern portion of Gaza. But I mean, this is all a culmination of what is effectively collective punishment from the government of Israel on the Palestinians living in Gaza. They say Palestinians in the besieged coastal enclave struggle to find food, water, and safety ahead of an expected Israeli ground offensive in the war sparked by Hamas's deadly attack. So, I mean, obviously I would take issue with sort of this characterization of the current events unfolding in front of our eyes. But, I mean, I think the key point here is to focus on the Israeli ground offensive that is upcoming. Obviously, I touched yesterday or 2 days ago on them basically telling the people in the north of Gaza to flee south. Over 1 million Gaza residents to just simply, I guess, pack up their things and leave within a 24-hour period, although that 24-hour period has now already expired at this point. But I mean, again, just a completely ridiculous sort of like ethnic cleansing response or requirement there from the government of Israel to tell 1 million people to leave in the middle of a what is effectively a destroyed Gaza Strip, where you have roads that are impassable, you have monumental amounts of civilian infrastructure that has been destroyed, you have reports that the Israeli military has been targeting people with some of their strikes as they are trying to flee south. So that demand in and of itself was completely ridiculous from the outset. But also, I mean, again, the war sparked by Hamas's deadly attack, as if the situation between Israel and Palestine just like started on October 7th during that Hamas attack, that there's no other history that goes on there in terms of how Hamas came to this position and power in the first place within Gaza. I mean, we've talked about, guys like Benjamin Netanyahu openly saying that, the Israeli government should support Hamas as a cudgel against the potential formation of a Palestinian state. So, I mean, so much more obvious history that goes into this, but they sort of just condense it into that reductive analysis there. But they continue saying that Israeli forces, supported by a growing deployment of U.S. warships in the region, positioned themselves along Gaza's border and drilled for what Israel said would be a broad campaign to dismantle the militant group. So again, a couple of different things there. We have a massive escalation from the United States positioning different warships in the Mediterranean Sea in this region, and also sort of mildly threatening Iran, that if Iran somehow gets involved in this, which they've kind of hinted that they potentially will if this offensive into Gaza continues to be as brutal as it has been. So you have the U.S. positioning a bunch of these warships in the region to, I guess, potentially widen this conflict and maybe even involve several other countries as well, which I don't need to remind you guys would be an absolute disaster for everybody involved. And again, this sort of broad campaign to dismantle Hamas within Gaza, with seemingly no plan for what would happen after that, who would replace Hamas if you go in and destroy the entirety of it. And also, I mean, it's just kind of reminiscent of what the United States did in Iraq, where you go in and you topple the government of Saddam Hussein, and then you leave this power vacuum, and oh, what do you know, that leads to the rise of ISIS. I mean, sort of a similar thing here. You can go in and you can kill every single member of Hamas's militant wing, and also, by the way, kill thousands of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children in the process of that. But what is that going to accomplish in the long run? I mean, you are currently engaging in essentially a radicalization process by terrorizing the people of Gaza right now. I mean, what do you think that's going to do to young children who are currently seeing, their family members, their friends, their community being bombed into oblivion, right? It's not as if Hamas is just some isolated military wing within the Gaza Strip, and then you can just kill them and move along, about your day as if that's going to solve anything. It's absolutely not. It's just going to continue this cycle of violence into, years and years and years into the future. But they say a week of blistering airstrikes have demolished entire neighborhoods but failed to stem militant rocket fire into Israel. And here are the latest numbers. They say, according to the Gaza Health Ministry, 2,450 Palestinians have been killed so far and 9,200 have been wounded since the fighting erupted. That also includes over 400,000 who have been internally displaced during this offensive, which is more than the 2014 Gaza war, which lasted over 6 weeks. They say that makes us the deadliest of the 5 Gaza wars for both sides. I mean, again, it's not a war. It's kind of like, I've heard somebody else, I think it was Shark Zero, made this analogy. It's like as if you have like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or some WWE fighter who's beating the shit out of a small chihuahua or something, and then you turn around and you say, oh, well, it was deserved because, the chihuahua bit at his heels or something like that. I mean, this is not a comparison here. This is not a war between two massive militaries or something like that. You have a military in Israel that is backed up by the wealthiest and most powerful country and military in the entire world, the United States of America, that is giving a full endorsement of essentially all of their actions in Gaza right now. And then you have Hamas, which is essentially, a couple 10,000 soldiers or whatever, or militants, that have no advanced military equipment. I mean, they don't have an air force. They're not flying F-15s into Israel, which is why you saw them on those sort of like homemade paragliders when they were going into the October 7th attack into southern Israel. I mean, these military powers are not even remotely comparable. Okay, so I think that's also an important thing to point out here, as if this is sort of a war between two powerful militaries. Like, no, this is currently a slaughter, is what we are seeing in Gaza right now. So now we move on to this aspect of it as well, where we have reports here from Human Rights Watch that Israel is also using white phosphorus in Gaza and in Lebanon, which is obviously a banned munition and completely illegal according to international law. So a little bit more on that. They say Israel's use of white phosphorus in military operations in Gaza and Lebanon puts civilians at risk of serious and long-term injuries, Human Rights Watch said today in releasing a question and answer document on white phosphorus. They say Human Rights Watch verified videos taken in Lebanon and Gaza on October 10th and 11th in 2023, respectively, showing multiple airbursts of artillery-fired white phosphorus over the Gaza City port and 2 rural locations along the Israel-Lebanon border, and interviewed 2 people who described an attack in Gaza. They say white phosphorus, which can be used either for marking, signaling, and obscuring, or as a weapon to set fire that burns people and objects, has significant incendiary effects that can severely burn people and set structures, fields, and other civilian objects in the vicinity on fire. The use of white phosphorus in Gaza, one of the most densely populated places in the world, magnifies the risk to civilians and violates the international humanitarian law prohibition on putting civilians at unnecessary risk. And warning, this is going to be a pretty graphic description here, but I think it's important to understand what white phosphorus does, given the fact that Israel is currently using this on the population in Gaza. They say upon contact, white phosphorus can burn people thermally and chemically down to the bone, as it is highly soluble in fat and therefore in human flesh. White phosphorus fragments can exacerbate wounds even after treatment and can enter the bloodstream and cause multiple organ failure. Already, dressed wounds can reignite when the dressings are removed and the wounds are re-exposed to oxygen. Even relatively minor burns are often fatal for survivors. Extensive scarring tightens muscle tissue and creates physical disabilities. And of course, the trauma of the attack, the painful treatment that follows, and the appearance-changing scars lead to psychological harm and social exclusion. So, I mean, again, brazen war crimes that are being committed. We also had some allegations, as pointed out here by Trita Parsi of the Quincy Institute, that apparently there are some reports and confirmations here from Amnesty International that potentially Israel got some of this white phosphorus from, of course, the United States of America, that, again, as a reminder, gives around like $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel on an annual basis to continue their apartheid, to continue their ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. And obviously it seems like if these reports are true, that we are directly aiding and abetting in these war crimes with the use of white phosphorus. So I can't 100% confirm that, but this is just, I wanted to let you guys know that this was something else that was floating around as well. And I'm not going to go through the entirety of this, but this was a really good write-up here by Yanis Varoufakis, who basically outlined explicitly, comparing some of the statutes from the International Criminal Court and international humanitarian humanitarian law and international laws of war, and compared that to some of the statements from Israeli politicians and some of the actions that we have already seen during this week-long offensive into Gaza, and basically just goes through and documents directly all of the different various war crimes and violations of international law that Israel could be found guilty of if they ever submitted themselves to the International Criminal Court, which they are not a party to, but these are just some of the things that they are currently doing. So again, I'll link that down below if you want to go read through the entirety of it. It was a great write-up there by Giannis. So moving on here. Now we get to sort of like the U.S. political analysis of this, I guess, or what we've gotten from the Joe Biden administration, from U.S. politicians as well. I mean, this is one of the more recent statements from President Biden, which is, I think, slightly less genocidal than some of the other things I've seen him and his representatives say. But, this is basically, it seems like, the most pushback that we are going to get in terms of defending, innocent Palestinian lives in Gaza that are currently being taken away by the Israeli military. He says, "We must not lose sight of the fact that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians had nothing to do with Hamas's appalling attacks." That's true, and are suffering as a result of them. So, I mean, listen, this is, you could look at this and you could give a really good faith interpretation, or I guess a more positive and generous interpretation, and you could say, okay, he's saying that, Palestinians shouldn't be punished for, the attack that Hamas launched into southern Israel. But another way to look at this is that you are the most powerful person on the face of the planet, okay? You have more leverage, arguably, than any other person in the world in terms of pressuring Israel to stop this campaign in Gaza, okay, to stop the slaughter of thousands of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children. And the most that you are willing to come out and say is what exactly? That this is all the fault of Hamas? I mean, that's sort of the implicit thing that he's trying to get at here, right? Again, Palestinians had nothing to do with Hamas's appalling attacks and are suffering as a result of them. So what he's saying here is essentially, as I pointed out in my tweet responding to it, is that Israel has no agency in this equation. As if, like, Israel's attacks into Gaza are just sort of like a force of nature, that they are just like a natural weather event or something that Hamas is responsible for. I mean, it's completely ridiculous, right? We're talking about a highly advanced military that's backed up by the United States of America, and you're saying there's no blame to be assigned on the government of Israel, especially given some of the genocidal rhetoric we've heard from Israeli politicians during the last week. There's no blame to be put on their shoulders, no responsibility or accountability to be put on their shoulders for going in and bombing schools and hospitals and mosques and marketplaces and apartment buildings and killing so far over 750 people, children within Gaza, 750 children, okay? I saw reports that there have been over 40 entire families that have been wiped off of the registry within Gaza, okay? 40 bloodlines, entire families completely wiped off the map. And we're here saying what? That this is all the fault of Hamas, that Israel has no responsibility for following in accordance with international law during their so-called counteroffensive. I mean, again, it's pathetic. And honestly, I mean, again, you're complicit in it at this point, right? And we also had this, of course, that I've touched on a couple of different times, but just as a reminder, I mean, we had members of the squad, right? People like AOC, Ilhan Omar, especially Rashida Tlaib, who's a Palestinian American, Cori Bush, several others, who came out and obviously showed sympathy with the Israelis who were affected by that Hamas attack that killed, innocent Israeli civilians, right? And then just followed it up by calling for de-escalation, by calling for an end to the bloodshed, by calling out Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing and some of the underlying reasons as to how we got to this point in the first place. And the White House, the White House spokesperson here, Karine Jean-Pierre, when she was asked about them, turned around and said they are repugnant and disgraceful. Okay, and I saw other reports that I, again, talked about yesterday, where the State Department is putting out guidelines saying that, government officials should not be using words like de-escalation and end the bloodshed and restoring calm, okay? I mean, this is what our government is doing. Somehow you are in the wrong if you're calling for de-escalation. I mean, think about what kind of a world that we live in where that means that you're in the wrong, according to the United States government. That means that you're repugnant and disgraceful if you're calling for innocent Palestinians to not be slaughtered in response to the Hamas attack. I mean, again, this is the U.S. government for you, right? We also had this statement here from the presidential Secretary of State nominee, Anthony Blinken, who said, "What separates Israel, the US, and other democracies when it comes to difficult situations like this is our respect for international law and the laws of war," right? Now, this was not at the very beginning, before Israel launched this bombing campaign and upcoming invasion into Gaza. This was like already after they had committed multiple war crimes, okay, and collective punishment of the people of Gaza, cutting off their electricity, their water, etc., right? And as pointed out here by Prem, he says, since Anthony Blinken said this, Israel has killed journalists, medics, and UN staff, was found to be using white phosphorus, as we just talked about, boasted about using 6,000 bombs to raise entire city blocks. Keep in mind, this is an area that's like roughly the size of Detroit. 6,000 bombs, and ordered 1.1 million Gazans to leave the north in 24 hours, only to kill some of them who were trying to follow with that order. Okay, so this is, I guess, following in accordance with international law and the laws of war. I mean, just utter and complete bullshit. We also had here on CNN, a CNN anchor who I think was asking a very obvious and fair question, and just look at the response from one of these analysts here in terms of just having absolutely no single solitary shit to give about the innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. Let's watch this clip here real quick.
But does that mean, does that mean starve the Palestinian people, continue to, because they will be so hungry and will be so desperate for water and medicine, that then they will give up Hamas?
It sounds callous, but I mean, this is a war.
It sounds callous, but this is a war. So apparently being in a so-called war means that you then have you have the free pass to go commit a bunch of war crimes, to starve a population of 2 million people. That's what we're saying now. And I mean, compare and contrast this to how U.S. politicians and officials and military personnel and analysts and pundits all talked about the war in Ukraine, right? When you had that Russian trying to end the grain deal, for example, to cut off some supplies into Ukraine, you had people like Ursula von der Leyen, right? And, Zelensky himself and U.S. politicians like Joe Biden, who came out and said, these are brazen war crimes. This is collective punishment. This is completely illegal. Putin is a war criminal. He needs to be tried at The Hague, right? Or removed from power entirely. And then look at the difference in analysis when it's Israel and Palestine. Now we're siding with the occupier. Now we are siding with the war criminals. Okay, so I mean, again, it just shows you like there is no fundamental underlying principles here from the perspective of the U.S. government. It's just who's our ally, who's our enemy, and we'll completely do a 180 on the rhetoric depending on what the case may be in that kind of a circumstance. I mean, again, Jesus Christ. It sounds intense, it sounds, callous, but this is a war, and this is a retired U.S. general apparently giving that kind of an analysis, right? Again, think about the difference between that and the situation in Ukraine and the analysis that we got from the U.S. government when Russia was doing similar things to what, Israel is doing right now. Just a complete 180. We also have motherfuckers like Tom Cotton, of course, on Fox News on Sunday. He said, as far as I'm concerned, Israel can bounce the rubble in Gaza. Anything that happens in Gaza is the responsibility of Hamas. Hamas killed women and children in Israel last weekend. Yeah, they did kill women and children in Israel last weekend, which apparently, I guess, in the minds of guys like Tom Cotton and others, just means like what? The answer is to go in and kill innocent women and children in Gaza? That seems to be literally what the logic is here. I mean, Israel can bounce the rubble in Gaza. Anything that happens in Gaza is the responsibility of Hamas. I mean, think about this logic being used in any other context, right? Whether it's the United States, whether it's any of our other allies around the world, that anything that happens, there's no agency for the government of Israel, for the military of Israel, no accountability. It's 100% on Hamas's shoulders, no matter how reckless Israel is with their collective punishment, with their brazen war crimes. Okay, it's all on the shoulders of Hamas. It's completely insane, right? And again, this is a little bit more open and brazen in terms of his analysis here, just in your face, kind of laying it out there that he doesn't give a shit about the people in Gaza. But this is the same exact general concept from what we just read from Joe Biden, right? It's basically no difference because, Joe Biden's analysis was essentially the same thing. It was, we must not lose sight that this is, again, basically blaming the entirety of it on Hamas. Any suffering that's happening in Gaza, that is a fault of Hamas. Israel has nothing to do with it, right? We also had this interview with Jake Tapper where he was interviewing an Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, right? Keep in mind, they've already killed multiple UN staffers during their ongoing bombardment in Gaza. And here's the quote. Quote, I really feel sorry for the suffering of the people of Gaza. Sure you do. But we should all remember, they elected Hamas 18 years ago. And as pointed out here by Nathan, half of the population in Gaza wasn't even alive 18 years ago. Half the population in Gaza are children. And even if they weren't, the idea that there was one election that was held 17 years ago, therefore everybody who lives under, the government or rule of Hamas is responsible for every action that they take. I mean, think about if this standard was applied to the United States of America, for example, okay? If that logic was applied to Americans, then you could say it's totally fine for Iraqis, for example, to come over to the United States and slaughter, American civilians, because we elected the George W. Bush government. He went in and he invaded Iraq, and so we are all collectively responsible for his actions and his war crimes and the killing of, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. I mean, that's the kind of logic that's being deployed here. It's completely insane. And also, as pointed out here by Ryan Grimm from the same interview, Jake Tapper tells the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. that there isn't time for civilians to leave North Gaza in time ahead of the invasion, and he said, quote, "I don't know of any pressure coming from the Biden administration to hold our operation," the ambassador tells him. So listen, I mean, that's your update for today. We have, allegations of widespread war crimes. We have the United States government, like people like Joe Biden, who seem to think that, giving vague condemnations of the suffering of the people in Gaza is going to be enough to stop what is coming from the Israeli military, but it's not. And, over the next couple of days, especially if they launch this massive ground invasion, latest estimate that I saw was like 300,000 Israeli troops. I mean, they're going to be going door to door, and they're going to be killing, anybody who's left, I guess. That seems to be the indications that we've gotten from the Israeli military, right? That there's not going to be much of a distinguishing between combatant and otherwise. And that's part of the reason why I think that they gave that warning, so-called warning, to say, okay, everybody in the north, go flee to the south, as if that's logistically possible. I think that was sort of their way of getting some sort of a bare thin excuse to say, well, if you stayed here, then that's your responsibility. We gave you a warning to leave, right? If you stayed here, maybe you are connected to Hamas in some way and you're trying to fight back against us. So, I mean, listen, it's one of the most horrific situations that's happening in the entire world right now. I don't think in my entire 24 years on this earth I have ever been this disgusted with the United States government, and it just seems like this is going to continue to spiral and spiral until it could even potentially expand to a broader conflict as well, not just with Israel and Gaza and the West Bank, which, by the way, there's also been escalations in the West Bank. I've seen videos, as I showed you guys, of Israeli settlers going and killing Palestinians point blank range, completely unarmed Palestinians being shot and killed right in front of the IDF with no accountability whatsoever. So the West Bank could end up exploding as well. But you could also, again, I mean, I'm probably going to have to do another video on this either today or tomorrow, but you also have the potential for this to expand into a conflict involving the United States directly, and Iran, and potentially elements in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, and all of these different countries that could potentially be getting involved in this. And then before you know it, we're in like a sort of like spiral to a World War III kind of scenario. So it's just an absolute disaster. And I mean, obviously I wish that we were having serious conversations about de-escalation, but according to the United States government, I guess that makes you an utter disgrace and repugnant in your analysis, if that's what you want.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying